For all the denials, the shifting of blame, and just plain lies, nothing beats this for rank hypocrisy. And we're part of it. The democratic dogs of war were unleashed upon a miserable state, and then claimed victory atop the moral high ground of liberation and freedom. But soon enough, the victors fell off the mountain by imitating the vanquished, with a cant display of thuggery, hubris, and hair-splitting.
There is a difference between interrogation and interview. That is clearly spelled out.
This is Australia today, towards the pinnacle of Western civilization, a champion of liberalism, the rule of law, and high democracy. Yet we blinked away recent history and locked up men, women, and children seeking refuge from persecution. Shame on us. We're quick to rain on others.
And Dr. Mahat here, and any other recalcitrants.
Australia should stop behaving as if it is there to teach us how to run our country.
But do we still live in a healthy democracy?
I think we are a healthy democracy, but you see perhaps a little fraying around the edges and some little frustrations popping up.
What is a parliamentary democracy? We elect representatives to Parliament, which then selects a government according to party numbers. By this system, the government is responsible to both the Parliament and the people. Is it still?
There's a general decline in Western democracies. Australia's not alone in this. There's a general mismatch between belief in democracy and confidence in democratic institutions. We've got serious problems relating to things like political finance. We have a very laissez-faire attitude towards who can give money to political parties, and that's an issue, I think, in terms of public confidence in our democracy, and it's an issue in terms of a level playing field for political parties.
To paraphrase Lincoln, democracy is government of the people, by the people, and for the people. An alternative to mad clerics and bloody kings, it became a third way for imperial powers like Britain, and more recently the US, which exports it with evangelical zeal.
Prime Minister John Howard is a leader of exceptional courage, who exemplifies the finest qualities of one of the world's greatest democracies. Proud to call him friend.
But in all the fuss and flag-waving, we've forgotten to keep democracy in check.
Over the voting screen and vote 1, 2, 3, 4.
The basic problem that we have is that we are not teaching young people thoroughly enough on how their system of government works.
Have you voted before this election? No.
And over time, I see this as being potentially dangerous in the context that history shows that when people ignore their democracy and forget about it, then other things can take over. I'm not saying that would necessarily happen in the case of Australia, but for good governments, for successful governance, I think a very good education in civics and how we're governed is essential.
Okay. Has anybody got an absolute majority? Apple, so it's very safe for them.
While it may look as easy as apples and oranges, simply voting for one party in Australia doesn't necessarily mean that vote is counted as such.
We have some quite basic problems about elections here. We haven't yet managed to achieve the basic democratic principle of one vote, one value. With above-the-line voting, parties are able to direct preferences in a way which would not necessarily be endorsed by their voters at all. And we saw that in Victoria, where a representative of the Family First Party was elected with less than 2% of the primary vote. But parties such as the Australian Labor Party and the Australian Democrats had directed their preferences to Family First, and Voters voted for those parties above the line, little knowing where those votes would end up.
So you don't always get what you want, you get what you deserve.
People no longer vote for their representatives in Parliament. They vote for a leader. Members of Parliament are not able to play a true representative role in any case because they are bound by the very tight party discipline that we have in this country. And basically they're there to support their leaders. The executive government, particularly the Prime Minister of the day, dominates.
That just makes government more efficient, doesn't it?
Well, it's not more efficient because in the long run you have less deliberation about where government's going, about where policies are taking us, and at the end of the day you have bigger mistakes and bigger problems.
Told the day after.
The basis to a healthy democracy, an informed opinion.
What's happened, I think, is that Australian citizens are suffering from time poverty. Working hours are increasing. They're working longer hours than citizens in European democracies, for example, often balancing work and family responsibilities. This makes it difficult to digest sufficient information to really hold governments to account.
And how do you get information to make a decision when most of it comes from just a handful of sources who have their own agendas to push, usually profit-driven? Independence? Dream on, Pinko. And besides, there's no ratings or money in it.
In Australia today we have commercial television which is essentially uninterested in any serious political discussion. And then you have a media in the press which is astonishingly 70% dominated by one foreign owner of a highly political nature, Rupert Murdoch, and the rest with Fairfax and virtually nothing else. So you don't even have a duopoly, you have a somewhere between a duopoly and a monopoly. And if the owner who has 70% cares about the political line of his newspapers, and we know that Rupert Murdoch does, you then have a situation where on certain issues, one line, for example, over the Iraq War or over the American-Australian alliance or over free trade or the free trade agreement with the United States and many other things, even more strikingly over the question of media regulation, where one line comes daily to a large proportion of the population. And if you have no commercial television challenging that, and if you have an ABC which every time it shows any kind of sign of difference from the mainstream view is sat upon as a conspiracy of left-wingers, you have, in my view, a recipe for a very, very simple-minded society.
Is our cherished liberal democracy returning to the original decadent Roman era, with a witless mob placated by bread and circuses? The great unwashed, entertained by political jesters juggling with our future?
I sometimes characterise it as a situation now where the defining idea about making life better is currently material progress. That's associated with a sort of competitive, self-interested individualism which produces a shallow democracy. That is where we see our duties as citizens as essentially going out and voting every few years whoever offers us the best deal. So, for example, the biggest tax cut, and that then produces this very shallow democracy which diminishes well-being.
So, as a depressed, dumbed-down electorate, we have less time and choice but to believe everything we're told. Opinion polls, like horse races, only tell us who's ahead or who's behind, yet pollies can produce poll-driven policies. And we allow vast amounts of taxpayer money to be spent on propaganda. Sorry, information.
Since 2000, the federal government has become the biggest advertiser in Australia. It's ahead of those big corporations like McDonald's, Coles, Myer and so on. We've seen the amount of money spent by governments on advertising in the 6-month period immediately before elections rocketing up in the last 10 years. So whereas Paul Keating might have spent $9 million just before a federal election in 1996, in 1998, $29 million was spent by the federal government on advertising in the 6 months leading up to an election.
Millions spent on spin, slogans and slurs that bend, distort and hide truths. Manipulated media campaigns that undercut alternatives. That's what it's all about. Staying in power at any cost.
He's unbelievable.
What about the workers? The workers are better off under me, mate.
He's only got one policy: spend, spend, spend.
This is pie-in-the-sky stuff.
Insurance premiums will come down by at least 12%.
It's an absolute fact. Children were thrown into the water.
Wearily, we now accept backflips and lies from all sides. Non-core promises, economic circumstances beyond our control, even war based on intelligence at the time.
We had intelligence. The intelligence presented a strong circumstantial case.
No one apologises for stuff-ups.
This is a recession that Australia had to have.
Ministers never resign on principle anymore, while the small guy cops the blame.
One of the features of our system is that you're choosing between teams of career politicians, people who make politics their career, and who are really drawn from a very narrow sector of society. The actual membership of political parties is very narrow. Political parties are really factories for cloning candidates.
Reform the Labor Party or keep on fighting better.
That'll be right. Suburban solicitors to the right, union bullies to the left. On the road to Canberra. A town that's cloned sterility. Truly representative.
People don't participate in politics. Now that you can say that that's the fault of the electors themselves. They should be joining parties and they should be participating. But it's a sort of vicious circle because parties are so narrowly based, people aren't interested in attempting to join them and influence them.
Australia's reputation for political apathy is well deserved. After all, we continue to live in this lucky country that's getting richer by all accounts. So why bother getting angry and voting with your feet? Just let Canberra look after our best interests.
The government has decided to commit Australian forces to action to disarm Iraq because we believe it is right, it is lawful, and it's in Australia's national interest.
Hindsight now says all wrong. But how is it that in a nation of just 20 million, a cross-country show of dissent by 1 million people can't even slow for a moment a government's march to war? Whose democracy is it?
In the end, the decision to go to war is an executive decision.
The executive earns the right to decide by a parliamentary majority. But is a mandate a blank cheque to govern?
The idea that you give a blank cheque to government, you endorse everything that a government is going to do in the next parliamentary term, greatly limits the choice of the electors. They have to choose between bundles of ideologies and policies which are sold to them, and then they're stuck with them. And the claim that now that you've elected me, I'm entitled to do whatever I like, is just anti-democratic.
If we had not fought for parity of service, parity of price...
If our governments choose to interpret and take their mandate to the extreme, then their advisers are increasingly vital to the process of government. But is our public service, whose role is to administer the government's legislation and advise without fear or favour, still able to do so as required by a healthy democracy?
My name is Michael John Scrafton and I appear as an independent citizen.
They're there to salute and do as they're told, basically, not to raise difficult problems and certainly not to raise questions about whether the direction in which government's going is really in the public interest. So the public service has been significantly weakened, and a lot of government effort goes into concealing what goes on in the public service anyway.
Isn't it possible that if you can't recall how many telephone conversations that you had, that you may not be able to recall very clearly a lot of other events that happened?
I suppose the answer to that, Senator, is that I don't know if you've ever been in the position of having to explain to a Prime Minister that the position he's been taking for a month is wrong.
And it's not just individuals who are blackballed. Whole organisations can suffer similar vilification.
The famous Brazilian bishop once said, when I feed the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist. And more charities and non-government organisations in Australia are quite legitimately asking why the poor have no food, why the environment is being despoiled by rapacious business, and why the human rights of asylum seekers are being so severely eroded. And those organisations are being persecuted by the government. You know, I heard one senior executive, the chief executive of a major charitable organisation in Australia, who came out and opposed the government on a particular issue. The government minders went around the press gallery in Parliament House and spread malicious rumours about this man's sexual peccadilloes. Completely unfounded, completely untrue, but it's a systematic attempt to denigrate their critics, either in public or by rumour mongering amongst influential people. The government is increasingly intolerant of criticism. It wants to silence dissenting voices. It's put huge pressure on our public institutions to toe the party line. The public service has been politicised from one end to the other. The military have been drawn into the political games of the government. The High Court has been attacked by senior government ministers, and the Attorney-General has refused to defend the High Court.
So if you're now filled with enough doubt to question a policy, be careful, because you may be branded an elite, or part of the intelligentsia, or chattering classes, a champagne socialist, and so on. A convenient dismissal of dissent.
It's a very interesting concept because Rupert Murdoch is not a member of the elite. He is presumably a member of the ordinary people, whereas a senior lecturer in library studies at the University of Wollongong is definitely a member of the elite because she holds certain opinions about refugees or Aborigines. So it's an interesting concept, the elite, and it's one that's used to put people down.
So here's the rub. Ordinary mums and dads who take to the streets in protest over Iraq are in effect voicing an elitist argument. The difference is it's not called elitism when the multi-million-dollar business world questions government policy. That's because the money comes from the big end of town. Compared to Britain and New Zealand, business donations to political parties here are increasingly murky. Canada does not allow any corporate or union donations to political parties because of the potential to undermine confidence in the democratic process. Imagine that, Australian politics without corporate or union money. Preoccupied with working harder to earn more, to spend more, we just can't grasp a meaningful role for us in our democratic process anymore. Rather than deciding for ourselves, we are told what to think by an increasingly professional political industry via their advertising agencies and the media, who in turn donate money back to the political parties. Funny that.
Who do you believe on interest rates?
Interest rates, dog food, democracy, it's all the same sell job. So much for idealism, once the heart of politics.
The Commonwealth and the states and territories have agreed on a uniform and much tougher approach to gun laws.
Mr Speaker, it is the government's view that Australia's head of state should be an Australian.
It's been replaced by realism and managed accordingly.
Thousands of demonstrators were expected at the conference, sponsored by America's Forbes magazine.
They don't do this in New York, do they?
Deemed a medium-risk security threat, world CEOs are being guarded by a huge police operation.
100 or so police on foot, and that was several hours ago. Since then, there's been many more that have turned up.
What we need to see is a change of the defining idea to sustainability or sustainable development, where economic growth isn't the overriding priority. This would embody what some sociologists are talking about as a new form of individualism, an altruistic cooperative individualism, which produces a deep democracy where our role as citizens is reflected in pretty much every choice we make in our lives, and that leads then to stronger communities, families and better well-being.
In 1988, the new Parliament House was opened and dedicated to us. A grand house on the hill which we could access in a very Australian way. Today, circumstances have changed again. The barriers are going up around the House of the People. We seem to have less control over Canberra, and they seem to know it. We go to the polls, but we're not properly informed anymore, thanks to our Western treadmill lifestyles, spin merchants, and a two-bob media. Information is highly manipulated, and dissent is not allowed. Bread and circuses.
In the end, this place, this chamber, along with the Senate, is the ultimate guarantor of democracy and the sort of way of life that we believe in.
But do we believe in organised politics that offers democracy for sale? What is leadership if it's not honest, open and inspiring?
We're a rich, diverse and quite excellent country. We deserve a rich, diverse and clear democracy, led by excellent people with ideas and responsibilities. Not a busload of suburban accountants.
Liberals used to, small L liberals that is, used to believe that as it were, one of the most precious aspects of a democracy was the contention of ideas. And it's a John Stuart Mill idea that in the end, as it were, good public policy and sound government emerges from the healthy contention of ideas and a kind of respect for ideas even when one disagrees with them, then you'd have to say that our democracy is, I think, becoming increasingly unhealthy.
We're not allowed to have a debate on second reading. We're going to gag the committee process. We're going to gag...
It's a peculiar thing because in some ways, everyone knows that at the moment at least the material prosperity of the place has never been greater, and that's a wonderful thing. It's a sort of dream of socialists once that ordinary people would lead a basically decent life. Not always, but to some extent that's now true. But on the other hand, the other part of the dream, which is that we'll work towards a better society through the cut and thrust of debate and through the respect for debate, I think is diminishing and has diminished pretty rapidly over the last maybe 20 years.
Politics is a manipulative science that needs our understanding and control. After all, it's our country. But we're losing it because erosion is all around us. Less time to think and no time to make a difference to our decadent democracy.
Rebellion from below is the only way the system will change.
Good God, what? Anarchy? Revolution?
Well, rebellions can be fairly peaceful to start with, and as the problems get worse, the rebellions have to be worse to fix them. But I think a political rebellion from below by the electors is the only way to fix the problems that we have at the moment.
or at least a decent education.
Education's really struggling. It's a funny thing that in Australia we claim that we value young people and we talk very beautifully about that, but we show our contempt for them by the amount of money that we allocate to their education, for example, by the way that we structure schools. There is evidence everywhere we look at just how little we value children. And so we talk the talk but don't walk the walk.
For all the denials, the shifting of blame, and just plain lies, nothing beats this for rank hypocrisy. And we're part of it. The democratic dogs of war were unleashed upon a miserable state, and then claimed victory atop the moral high ground of liberation and freedom. But soon enough, the victors fell off the mountain by imitating the vanquished, with a cant display of thuggery, hubris.
But do we still live in a healthy democracy?
I think we are a healthy democracy, but you see perhaps a little fraying around the edges and some little frustrations popping up.
What is a parliamentary democracy?
We elect representatives to Parliament, which then selects a government according to party numbers. By this system, the government is responsible to both the Parliament and the people. Is it still?
There's a general decline in Western democracies. Australia's not alone in this. There's a general mismatch between belief in democracy and confidence in democratic institutions. We've got serious problems relating to things like political finance. We have a very laissez-faire attitude towards who can give money to political parties, and that's an issue, I think, in terms of public confidence in our democracy, and it's an issue in terms of a level playing field for political parties.
To paraphrase Lincoln, democracy is government of the people, by the people, and for the people. An alternative to mad clerics and bloody kings, it became a third way for imperial powers like Britain, and more recently the US, which exports it with evangelical zeal and hair-splitting.
There is a difference between interrogation and interview. That is clearly spelled out.
This is Australia today, towards the pinnacle of Western civilization, a champion of liberalism, the rule of law, and high democracy. Yet we blinked away recent history and locked up men, women and children seeking refuge from persecution. Shame on us. We're quick to rain on others.
And Dr. Mahat here and any other recalcitrants.
Australia should stop behaving as if it is there to teach us how to run our country.
Sir John Howard is a leader of exceptional courage, who exemplifies the finest qualities of one of the world's greatest democracies. Proud to call him friend.
But in all the fuss and flag-waving, we've forgotten to keep democracy in check.
Over the voting screen and vote 1, 2, 3, 4.
The basic problem that we have is that we are not teaching young people thoroughly enough on how their system of government works.
Have you voted before this election? No.
And over time, I see this as being potentially dangerous in the context that history shows that when people ignore